The silence in the Riverside Community Center was almost suffocating. 347 people packed into a space meant for 200, their bodies pressed together in the late October heat, their breath creating a humid tension that seemed to mirror the fractured state of their town. At the center of this uncomfortable gathering, on a small wooden stage, barely elevated 6 inches from the floor, sat a man who most of them had seen 1,000 times, but never truly noticed. Vernon Crawford, 72 years old. The janitor. His hands rested on the yellowed keys of an old upright piano, fingers gnarled by decades of mopping floors and emptying trash cans. His work shirt faded blue, with his name embroidered over the pocket in thread that had lost its brightness years ago, seemed almost comically out of place on what passed for a stage. Around his neck hung a simple silver chain, catching the harsh fluorescent light in ways that made it seem like the only bright thing in the entire room. "This is a waste of time," someone muttered from the back. The voice carried in the stillness, and a few people nodded in agreement. Vernon's eyes remained closed. Pastor James Wilson stood off to the side, his normally confident posture slightly slumped, his face bearing the weight of a man who had tried everything else and was now grasping at what seemed like a desperate, foolish last resort. He had introduced Vernon 3 minutes ago, and in those 3 minutes, the skepticism in the room had grown from a murmur to something almost tangible, a living thing that fed on doubt and exhaustion. Tommy Sullivan, a former mill worker whose weathered face told the story of 5 years of unemployment and bitterness, crossed his arms tighter across his chest. He had come to this meeting ready to fight, ready to shout down whatever naive solution the pastor had concocted this time. A janitor playing piano. What kind of insult was this? But then Vernon's fingers moved. The first note that emerged from that old piano shouldn't have been possible. It was pure and clear, cutting through the thick air like light through fog. And in that single note, something shifted. The second note followed, then a third, and suddenly the room was no longer in Riverside, Tennessee. It was somewhere else entirely, somewhere where pain could be beautiful and brokenness could sing. This is the story of how one man's secret saved a town from destroying itself. This is the story of what happens when silence finally finds its voice. This is the story of Vernon Crawford and the ballad that changed everything. But to understand how we got to this moment, we need to go back. Back before the music. Back to when Riverside was dying and nobody knew how to save it. 5 years before Vernon sat at that piano, Riverside, Tennessee was a different place. Not better exactly, but different. The Riverside Textile Mill, which had been the beating heart of the town for 93 years, closed its doors on a gray Tuesday morning in March. No warning. No gradual wind down. Just a notice posted on the gate, and 742 people suddenly without jobs, without purpose, without the identity that had defined their families for generations. The mill's closure didn't just take away paychecks. It took away the scaffolding that held the community together. The Friday night gatherings at Murphy's Diner, the softball league, the Christmas party where everyone from the floor workers to the managers sang carols together. All of it disappeared like smoke. What filled the void was uglier. Accusations about who was to blame. Arguments about what should have been done differently. Old resentments that had been buried under the routine of work and community suddenly erupted like fault lines after an earthquake. The town split along every possible division, black and white, old and young, those who wanted to stay and fight, and those who wanted to leave and start over. By the time our story begins, Riverside wasn't just economically depressed. It was spiritually fractured. Neighbors who had borrowed sugar from each other for 20 years now crossed the street to avoid speaking. The town council meetings became shouting matches. 3 businesses closed for everyone that tried to stay open. Children asked their parents why people were so angry all the time, and the parents had no good answers. Pastor Wilson watched it all from his small church on Maple Street, praying for something, anything that could bring healing. He organized meetings that ended in arguments. He started community projects that attracted only a handful of volunteers. He preached sermons about forgiveness and unity that seemed to evaporate the moment people walked out the church doors. Riverside was dying, but it was dying slowly, painfully, like a wound that refused to either heal or finish killing the patient. In the midst of all this chaos, Vernon Crawford moved through Riverside like a ghost. Every morning at 5:30, he arrived at Riverside High School, where he had worked as head janitor for 35 years. He unlocked doors, he mopped floors, he emptied trash cans. He fixed broken bathroom stalls and cleaned graffiti off lockers and replaced light bulbs in hallways that seemed to grow darker every year. The teachers knew his name, but few knew anything else about him. He was polite, but never chatty, present, but never intrusive, reliable to the point of being part of the architecture. If you asked any of the students to describe the janitor, they would struggle to provide details beyond old black guy who cleans stuff. Vernon lived alone in a small house on Birch Street, a street that had seen better days. The house itself was tidy but sparse, the kind of place that felt more like a waiting room than a home. He grocery shopped at the same store on the same day every week. He attended Pastor Wilson's church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew, 3 rows from the back, always on the left side. He spoke when spoken to, but rarely initiated conversations. To the people of Riverside, Vernon Crawford was exactly what he appeared to be: a quiet, aging man, doing humble work, living a humble life, bothering no one, and being bothered by no one in return. They had no idea. They didn't know that every night after the simple dinner he prepared for himself, Vernon would sit in the small back room of his house, where an old piano stood against the wall. They didn't know that his fingers, so weathered from years of janitorial work, could still move across those keys with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. They didn't know that the music he played in that small room could make angels weep. Most importantly, they didn't know why Vernon had buried this gift. They didn't know about the life he had lived before Riverside. They didn't know about the dreams that had died. They didn't know about Sarah. The whole town knew Vernon Crawford, but nobody knew Vernon Crawford. And that was exactly how he wanted it, until he couldn't hide anymore. Darius Johnson was 19 years old and angry at the world. His father had lost his job at the mill when Darius was 14, and he had watched his family slowly disintegrate over the 5 years that followed. His parents' marriage ended. His older brother moved to Atlanta, chasing opportunities that didn't exist in Riverside. Darius stayed working part-time at the gas station, taking classes at the community college, and wondering if his future would be anything more than watching his hometown die. On a Wednesday afternoon in late September, Darius cut through Riverside High School on his way home from class. The building was mostly empty, that dead zone, between the end of the school day and the start of evening activities. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he walked past the music room. That's when he heard it. Piano music. Not the halting, uncertain sounds of a student practicing scales. This was something else entirely, something that made Darius stop mid-stride, his breath catching in his throat. The music was complex, layered, the kind of thing he had only heard in movies or on those classical music stations his grandmother used to listen to. It poured out of the music room like water from a broken dam, urgent and beautiful and impossible. Darius approached the door slowly, almost afraid that if he moved too quickly, the music would stop. Through the small window in the door, he could see someone at the piano. It took him a moment to register who it was. Vernon, the janitor. The man he had passed in these hallways 1,000 times without a second thought. The man who was currently playing piano like he had been born to do it. Darius stood frozen, watching Vernon's hands move across the keys with impossible precision. The music was speaking in a language Darius didn't fully understand, but he felt it in his chest, in his throat, in the sting of tears that suddenly appeared in his eyes for reasons he couldn't explain. When Vernon finally stopped playing, the silence felt like a physical blow. Darius, without really meaning to, pushed open the door. The creak of the hinges made Vernon turn, and for a moment fear flashed across the older man's face. "I'm sorry," Darius said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I just heard..." He trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence. Vernon's expression shifted from fear to something more resigned. He looked down at his hands, then back at Darius. "How long have you been standing there?" Vernon asked quietly. "Long enough," Darius replied. He took a step into the room. How do you play like that? I've never heard anything like that in my life." Vernon was quiet for a long moment. Then, as if making a decision he had been putting off for years, he spoke. "I used to be a piano student. A long time ago, before I came to Riverside. A student where Berklee College of Music, in Boston." Darius felt his eyes widen. Berklee. He didn't know much about music schools, but he knew that name. "You went to Berklee, and you're working as a janitor." Vernon stood up from the piano bench, his movements slow, carrying the weight of years. "Life doesn't always go the way you plan, son." "But how did you go from Berklee to here?" Vernon looked at Darius for a long moment, as if measuring whether this young man could handle the answer. Finally, he spoke. "Sit down. If you want to know, I'll tell you, but it's not a happy story. 43 years ago, Vernon Crawford was 29 years old, and the world was his for the taking. He had graduated from Berklee at the top of his class, already making a name for himself in Boston's music scene. Critics called him a generational talent. His debut album was in production. Concert halls were calling. Everything he had dreamed of since he was 5 years old, and his grandmother first sat him at her piano, was coming true. And then there was Sarah. Sarah Mitchell, a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, with a laugh that could light up a room and a way of seeing through Vernon's carefully constructed confidence to the insecure boy underneath. They had met at a friend's wedding, and Vernon knew within 5 minutes of talking to her that she was going to change his life. 3 months later, he proposed. 6 months after that, they were married in a small ceremony that felt like the beginning of everything. Sarah believed in Vernon's music with a fierce, unwavering faith that sometimes embarrassed him. "You were put on this earth to make people feel," she would tell him. "Don't you dare waste that gift." On a Friday night in November, Vernon and Sarah were driving home from a performance at Symphony Hall. Vernon had debuted a new composition, a piece he had written for Sarah, and the audience had given him a standing ovation. He was flying high, talking about the future, about tours and recordings and all the possibilities stretching out before them. Sarah was quieter than usual, smiling, but distant. Vernon would replay that car ride in his mind 10,000 times over the years that followed, searching for clues he had missed, signs he should have seen. The truck came out of nowhere. A semi whose driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. Vernon saw it half a second before impact, just enough time to register what was about to happen, but not enough time to do anything about it. The crash happened in slow motion, and all at once. The sound of metal tearing, the explosion of glass, the sensation of his body being thrown against forces it was never designed to withstand. And then darkness. Vernon woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed. His left hand was wrapped in so many bandages it looked like a white club attached to his arm. His ribs were broken. His leg was shattered. But none of that mattered the moment he saw his mother's face and understood what the tears in her eyes meant. Sarah was gone. The truck had hit the passenger side. Sarah had died on impact. Vernon had survived, but his left hand, the hand that had coaxed miracles from piano keys, had been crushed. 3 surgeries, months of physical therapy. The doctors did everything they could, but some damage couldn't be repaired. He could move his fingers, could perform basic functions, but the precision, the speed, the delicate control required to play at the level he had achieved, that was gone. Vernon lost his wife and his music in the same moment. Everything he was, everything he had built his identity upon, vanished in the space between one breath and the next. The depression that followed was absolute. Vernon stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring whether he lived or died. He turned away from friends, from family, from the music community that tried to rally around him. He couldn't bear their pity, couldn't stand to hear their well-meaning suggestions that he could teach, could compose, could find other ways to stay in music. Without Sarah, and without his ability to play the way he needed to play, music wasn't a gift. It was torture. Every piano he saw was a reminder of what he had lost. Every note he heard was a ghost of the life that should have been his. So Vernon made a decision. He would leave Boston. Leave everything associated with his old life. He would go somewhere where nobody knew who he had been, where he could be invisible, where he wouldn't have to carry the weight of other people's expectations or his own shattered dreams. He chose Riverside almost at random, a small Tennessee town far from anywhere he had ever been. He took the first job he could find, janitor, at the local high school. He found a cheap house. He built a life that was small and quiet and required nothing from him except showing up and doing simple work. For years, he didn't touch a piano. Couldn't. The grief was too raw. But slowly, so slowly, he barely noticed it happening. Something shifted. The crushing weight of loss became a dull ache. He found an old piano at a yard sale, and almost against his will brought it home. Late one night, alone in his house, where no one could hear, he sat down and put his damaged hands on the keys. He couldn't play the way he used to. The speed was gone. The technical perfection was impossible, but something else emerged. His hands found a new language, one built not on virtuosity, but on emotion, on the weight of loss and survival, on the terrible beauty of continuing to live after everything meaningful had been taken away. Vernon played for himself, and only for himself. It was private, sacred, the one remaining connection to Sarah, to his old dreams, to the person he used to be. No one in Riverside knew. No one in Riverside needed to know. Until Darius heard him playing in that empty classroom. When Vernon finished his story, Darius sat in silence, his mind struggling to process everything he had just heard. The janitor he had ignored for years was a widower, a tragic figure, who had lost everything. The quiet man who mopped floors had once performed at Symphony Hall. "I'm sorry," Darius finally said the words, feeling inadequate. "I'm so sorry about your wife. About everything." Vernon nodded slowly. It was a long time ago. But you can still play. What I heard. Mr. Crawford, that was incredible. I play differently now. Not better, just different. Darius leaned forward, his young face intense. You need to share this. People need to hear you play. Vernon's response was immediate. No. But no, Vernon repeated firmer this time. What I play is private. It's between me and... He trailed off. But Darius understood. Between him and Sarah. Mr. Crawford, have you seen what's happening to this town? People hate each other. Everyone's angry all the time. My parents split up because of the stress. My best friend moved away. This place is dying and nobody knows how to fix it. I'm sorry about that, son. I truly am. But I'm a janitor. I'm not a savior. You're a musician, and music can change people. My grandmother used to say that. She'd be fighting with my grandfather, and then she'd put on some Marvin Gaye, and by the end of the album they'd be dancing in the kitchen. Music reaches people in ways that talking can't. Vernon looked at this young man with his earnest face and desperate hope, and he felt something crack inside his carefully constructed walls. Darius, I appreciate your faith, but it's been 40 years since I performed for anyone. I'm an old man with damaged hands. Whatever magic you think I have, I promise you it's not enough. Then why do you still play? The question hung in the air. Vernon didn't have an answer, or perhaps he had one he wasn't ready to say out loud. Darius stood up, recognizing that he wasn't going to win this argument today. I'm going to tell my old English teacher, Ms. Miller. She's been trying to organize community stuff. Maybe she can... Darius, please don't, Vernon said, alarm in his voice. But Darius was already at the door. I'm sorry, Mr. Crawford, but some secrets are too important to keep. He left Vernon sitting alone in the music room, the old janitor's reflection visible in the black surface of the piano, looking suddenly smaller than he had moments before. Vernon put his hands back on the keys, but he didn't play. Instead, he sat in silence, feeling the careful life he had built beginning to crack, and not knowing whether that terrified him or relieved him. The following Tuesday evening, Pastor James Wilson stood at the front of the Riverside Community Center, looking out at a crowd that seemed ready to tear itself apart. The meeting had been advertised as a community conversation about our future, but within 10 minutes, it had devolved into something uglier. Tommy Sullivan was on his feet, his face red with anger. We've been having these conversations for 5 years. 5 years of talking and nothing changes. Meanwhile, people are leaving. Businesses are closing. My daughter had to move to Memphis because there's no work here. So, excuse me if I'm not interested in another feel-good discussion that goes nowhere. Maria Rodriguez, who owned the struggling grocery store on Main Street, tried to respond. Tommy, I understand your frustration. We're all frustrated. But turning on each other isn't turning on each other. Tommy cut her off. I'm not turning on anyone. I'm facing reality. This town is done. We need to accept that and stop pretending there's some magical solution. So what's your suggestion? Came a voice from the other side of the room. It was Gerald Henderson, one of the few people who had managed to find work after the mill closed. We should all just give up. Is that it? Maybe we should, Tommy shot back. Maybe that's more honest than sitting in circles talking about hope and community while everything falls apart around us. Pastor Wilson raised his hands, trying to restore order. Everyone, please. We're not going to solve anything if we can't speak respectfully to each other. Respect. A woman near the back stood up. Vernon recognized her as Lisa Barnes, a black woman whose husband had been passed over for one of the few management jobs that survived the mill closure. You want to talk about respect? How about the respect my husband didn't get when they gave that supervisor position to someone with half his experience? How about the respect our neighborhood doesn't get when the city council only approves development projects on the white side of town? Now wait a minute, Gerald Henderson interjected. Nobody's talking about race here. That's the problem. Lisa fired back. "Nobody wants to talk about race. Nobody wants to talk about the real divisions in this town. We just want to pretend we're all in this together, when the truth is some of us are drowning while others are building lifeboats." The room erupted. Multiple people shouting at once. Old grievances spilling out. Accusations flying. Pastor Wilson kept trying to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. Vernon, standing in the back of the room where he had been quietly observing, felt his chest tighten. This was his town. These were his neighbors, and they were tearing each other apart. The pain in the room was palpable. A living thing that fed on itself and grew stronger with every angry word. After 30 minutes of increasingly hostile exchanges, Pastor Wilson finally gave up. "This meeting is adjourned," he said quietly, his voice carrying a defeat that made Vernon's heart ache. People filed out, many of them still arguing. Vernon saw Darius standing near the door, his young face etched with disappointment. Their eyes met briefly, and Vernon understood the unspoken question. Can you watch this and still say no? That night, Vernon sat alone in his small house, the shouting from the meeting still echoing in his mind. He had lived in Riverside for 38 years. He had mopped the floors of its school, walked its streets, grocery shopped alongside its people. He had thought he could remain separate from it, uninvolved, just passing through on his way to whatever waited on the other side of life. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Vernon walked to the back room where his piano waited. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his damaged hands hanging at his sides. Then slowly he sat down at the bench and placed his fingers on the keys. He began to play, but not any of the old pieces he knew by heart. This was something new. Something that came from a place so deep inside him he hadn't known it existed. His fingers found notes that spoke of the pain he had seen at the community center, of division and anger, and the terrible loneliness of watching people who should be united tear each other apart. As he played, memories flooded through him, not just of the meeting, but of years of quiet observation. The teacher who had cried in her classroom after school, overwhelmed by the challenges her students faced. The student who came to school hungry because his family couldn't afford enough food. The elderly woman he had helped carry groceries who told him she was afraid to leave her house at night because the neighborhood felt so unsafe now. All of it poured into the music. Every hurt he had witnessed, every fracture in the community he had noticed and said nothing about. The composition that emerged wasn't pretty. Not at first. It was discordant, angry, reflecting the chaos of a community in pain. But as Vernon played, something shifted. The angry notes began to find harmony. The discord resolved into something more complex, something that acknowledged the pain, but also suggested the possibility of healing. He played for 2 hours straight, until his hands ached and his eyes burned with tears. When he finally stopped, he sat in the darkness, breathing hard, feeling something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, purpose. Vernon had been hiding for 38 years, hiding from grief, from pain, from the possibility of loss. But sitting in that room with the notes of his new composition still hanging in the air, he understood something. He had lost Sarah. He had lost his career. He had lost the life he was supposed to live. But he was still alive, and perhaps that meant he still had something to give. The composition wasn't finished. It was rough, incomplete, full of gaps that would need to be filled. But it was a start. And for the first time in decades, Vernon allowed himself to imagine sharing his music with others. Not for applause or recognition, but because maybe, just maybe, it could help. He thought of Sarah, of the last thing she had said to him on the night of the accident, when they were driving home from his performance. She had been quiet. He remembered distant. But just before the crash, she had turned to him and said, "I'm so proud of you, Vernon. You have a gift that can touch people's souls. Promise me you'll never stop sharing it." He hadn't kept that promise. For 43 years, he had broken it every single day. Vernon looked down at his hands, damaged, but not destroyed. Imperfect, but still capable. And he made a decision. Rebecca Miller had been teaching English at Riverside High School for 16 years. She was 52 years old, divorced, with 2 grown children, who had moved away to build lives in cities where opportunities existed. She stayed in Riverside because she believed in public education, believed in giving kids a chance, even when everything around them was falling apart. She had known Vernon for all 16 years she had worked at the school. They had exchanged pleasantries thousands of times. She had always found him kind, reliable, and intensely private. When Darius came to her after school on Thursday, breathless with excitement about Vernon's secret, she was skeptical. "Ms. Miller, you have to hear him play," Darius insisted. "He went to Berkeley. He's incredible, like life-changing incredible." "Darius, even if that's true, what do you expect me to do about it?" "Talk to him. You're good at talking to people. He listens to you. I've seen you two chat in the hallways." Rebecca sighed. "Vernon is a private person. If he wanted people to know he could play piano, he would have told them. But that's the thing. He has this gift, and he's hiding it, and meanwhile our whole town is falling apart. You were at that meeting Tuesday. You saw what happened." Rebecca had been at the meeting. She had watched her community cannibalize itself and had driven home feeling a despair so deep it made her question why she stayed in Riverside at all. "What do you think piano music is going to do, Darius? Make people suddenly stop being angry?" "I don't know, but it's got to be better than nothing, and we've tried everything else." Against her better judgment, Rebecca agreed to talk to Vernon. She found him the next afternoon cleaning the cafeteria after school. They exchanged their usual greetings, and then Rebecca took a breath and dove in. "Vernon, Darius told me you play piano." Vernon's hands stilled on the mop handle. "He shouldn't have done that. He's worried about you, about the town. We all are." Vernon resumed mopping, not meeting her eyes. "I'm just a janitor, Rebecca. Nothing more." "I don't think that's true." Vernon stopped again this time, turning to face her fully. "What do you want from me?" Rebecca chose her words carefully. "I want you to share your gift, not for you, for us, for Riverside. I haven't performed in front of people in over 40 years. Then maybe it's time. You don't understand. What I play now, it's not professional. It's not polished. It's what?" Rebecca pressed gently. Vernon struggled with the words. "It's personal. It's all the things I can't say out loud." "Vernon, that's exactly what we need. We need something real. Something that cuts through all the anger and politics and just reaches people." Vernon was quiet for a long moment. Then in a voice so soft Rebecca almost didn't hear it, he said, "I've been working on something. A composition. About Riverside." Rebecca felt her heart beat faster. "Can I hear it?" Vernon looked terrified, but he also looked like a man who had already made a decision and was just working up the courage to follow through. "Not yet. It's not finished. But maybe when it is." "How long?" "I don't know. A week, 2. Rebecca wanted to push, wanted to secure a commitment before he changed his mind, but she could see how much this was costing him. "Okay, take the time you need. But Vernon, thank you for even considering it." Vernon nodded, his eyes distant, already halfway lost in the music only he could hear. The moment that finally pushed Vernon over the edge happened on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after his conversation with Rebecca. He was at the grocery store doing his weekly shopping when he heard crying. He followed the sound to the cereal aisle, where he found 8-year-old Emma Parker sitting on the floor, tears streaming down her face. Vernon knew Emma. She was the daughter of Michael and Jennifer Parker, who had both worked at the mill. Michael now drove a delivery truck, working 60 hours a week and barely making enough to support the family. Jennifer had taken a job at a nursing home in the next town over, leaving before Emma woke up and coming home after she went to bed. "Hey there," Vernon said gently, kneeling down beside her. "What's wrong?" Emma looked up at him, her small face red and blotchy. "My parents were fighting again. About money, about everything. And Mom said—" She dissolved into fresh sobs. "What did your mom say?" "She said maybe we should just give up on Riverside, that we should move somewhere else. But I don't want to move. All my friends are here. This is my home." Vernon felt something crack in his chest. He saw himself in this little girl, saw everyone in Riverside who was hurting and didn't know how to stop. He thought about the meeting at the community center, about the anger and pain that was eating the town alive. He thought about Sarah, about her belief that his music could touch souls. He sat down on the floor next to Emma, his old bones protesting, but his resolve hardening. "Emma, I want to tell you something. Sometimes things get really hard, and it feels like nothing can make them better. But there's always hope, even when we can't see it." "How do you know?" "Because I lost everything once, everything that mattered to me, and I survived. And eventually I found reasons to keep going." Emma wiped her nose on her sleeve. "Like what?" Vernon smiled. "Like little girls who need someone to tell them it's going to be okay." Emma managed a small smile back. "Are we going to be okay? Is Riverside?" Vernon looked at this child, at her hope and fear and desperate need to believe in something, and he made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "We're going to try. I promise we're going to try." After helping Emma find her mother and ensuring she was okay, Vernon walked home in a daze. He thought he had made peace with being invisible, with living a small life that touched no one deeply. But that was cowardice, dressed up as humility. Sarah had been right. If he had a gift hiding, it was the real selfishness. Vernon went home, sat at his piano, and played his composition from beginning to end. It was nearly finished now, refined through hours of late-night work. He called it Riverside's Lament, and it told the story of a community in pain searching for healing it didn't know how to find. When he finished playing, Vernon picked up his phone and called Rebecca Miller. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "I'll do it," he said. "Tell Pastor Wilson I'll play at the next community meeting." While Vernon prepared his composition, life in Riverside continued its slow-motion collapse. Each person carried their own private pain, their own reasons for anger, their own desperate hope for something to change. Maria Rodriguez stood behind the counter of Rodriguez Market, watching the empty aisles and doing math that never added up. The store had been her father's dream brought to life 40 years ago when he immigrated from Mexico. She had taken it over when he retired, promising to keep it thriving. But thriving was impossible now. Most people drove to the big chain store in the next town where prices were lower. Her customer base had shrunk along with the town's population. She was 3 months behind on her mortgage and 2 months away from closing forever. Maria was 58 years old, too young to retire, but too old to start over. The store wasn't just a business. It was her identity, her father's legacy, her connection to a community that increasingly felt like strangers. Every night, she prayed for a miracle. Every morning she opened the doors to emptiness. Tommy Sullivan sat in his small apartment, drinking his fourth beer of the afternoon, staring at the TV without seeing it. He was 61 years old and unemployed. After the mill closed, he had tried to find work. Tried everything. But who wants to hire a 60-year-old man whose only skill is operating machinery that doesn't exist anymore? The bitterness had grown in Tommy like a cancer. He was angry at the mill owners who took their profits and ran. Angry at the politicians who promised help that never came. Angry at the younger people who seemed to adapt more easily. Angry at himself for not seeing it coming, for not saving more money, for building his entire identity around a job that could disappear in a day. Tommy's anger made him say things he didn't fully mean, take positions more extreme than he believed, lash out at people who didn't deserve it. He knew he was becoming the worst version of himself, but he didn't know how to stop. The anger was all he had left. Without it, he'd have to face the fear underneath the terror of becoming invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. Pastor James Wilson sat in his small church office, his head in his hands, praying for wisdom he didn't feel. He had been the pastor of Riverside Community Church for 23 years. He had baptized babies and buried the elderly. He had counseled marriages and presided over divorces. He had preached hope through good times and bad. But this was different. This wasn't a crisis with a clear solution. This was a slow poisoning of the community's soul, and nothing he tried seemed to help. His congregation had shrunk by a third. The remaining members were divided, some angry and demanding action, others paralyzed by despair. His own faith felt tested in ways it never had before. Pastor Wilson was 56 years old, and for the first time in his ministry he questioned whether he was making any difference at all. When Vernon called and agreed to play, the pastor felt something he hadn't felt in months, a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Darius Johnson worked his shift at the gas station serving customers who barely looked at him, his mind 1,000 miles away. He was 19, and he was supposed to be planning his future. College career life. But how do you plan a future when you can't see past next week? His parents were done. His mom had moved in with her sister in Nashville. His dad was drinking again, something Darius had hoped was in the past. The community college classes Darius was taking felt pointless preparation for jobs that didn't exist. His friends were leaving one by one, chasing opportunities in bigger cities. Why was he staying? Because it was home. Because giving up on Riverside felt like giving up on himself. Because somewhere deep inside, Darius still believed that things could get better. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But he had heard Vernon play, and he had felt something shift inside him. If beauty like that could exist in the midst of all this ugliness, maybe there was still hope. The night before the community meeting, Vernon couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with doubts. What was he thinking? He was a 72-year-old janitor with damaged hands and a composition that poured out his grief and hope in equal measure. What made him think this would help? What if people laughed? What if they were offended? What if it changed nothing? At 2 a.m, Vernon got out of bed and went to his piano. He sat down, his hands resting on the keys, and he let himself remember Sarah. Really remember her, not the sanitized version he usually allowed himself, but the full, complicated, beautiful reality of who she had been. He remembered their first date, how she had laughed at his terrible jokes and made him feel like the most interesting person in the world. He remembered the way she would hum while cooking dinner, always slightly off-key. He remembered her hand in his at Symphony Hall, the last performance they attended together, her pride in him radiating like heat. He remembered the moment in the hospital when he understood she was gone. The howl of grief that had torn from his throat. The way the world had instantly become dimmer, colder, emptier. The months that followed when breathing felt like an act of violence against her memory. But he also remembered something she had said to him once early in their marriage, when he was struggling with a difficult composition. "Vernon, you're trying too hard to make it perfect. Just let it be honest. Honest is always more powerful than perfect." Riverside's lament wasn't perfect. His technique wasn't what it used to be. His hands couldn't execute the pieces he had once played effortlessly. But it was honest. Brutally, vulnerably honest. Vernon began to play softly at first, then building. He played through the entire composition, letting it wash over him. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, then spoke out loud for the first time in years to the wife who wasn't there. "I'm scared, Sarah. I'm terrified. But you were right. I can't keep hiding this. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least I'll have tried." In the silence of his small house, Vernon felt something he hadn't felt in 4 decades. Peace. Not happiness, not certainty, but a quiet acceptance that he was doing what he was meant to do. He went back to bed, and surprisingly slept. The next evening, as Vernon prepared to leave for the community center, he put on his best shirt and the silver chain Sarah had given him on their first anniversary. He looked at himself in the mirror, seeing an old man weathered and worn, but perhaps not quite as invisible as he had been trying to be. Vernon drove to the community center with his hands steady on the wheel, even as his heart hammered in his chest. He had no idea what was about to happen. He only knew that hiding was no longer an option. For better or worse, Vernon Crawford was about to be seen. The Riverside Community Center filled slowly, people arriving with the wary reluctance of those who had been disappointed too many times before. They came because Pastor Wilson had practically begged them, because they had nothing better to do on a Tuesday evening, because some tiny part of them still held on to hope even as their minds insisted it was foolish. Tommy Sullivan came, arms already crossed, jaw already set. Maria Rodriguez closed her store early and arrived with her elderly father, who insisted on coming despite his failing health. Darius was there, of course, standing near the back with Rebecca Miller, both of them scanning the crowd nervously. Lisa Barnes came with her husband, their faces showing the exhaustion of 5 years of fighting. The mayor attended, along with several council members, their presence more political obligation than genuine interest. 347 people in a space meant for 200. The air conditioning struggled and failed to keep up with the body heat. People fanned themselves with programs. Conversations were muted wary. Nobody knew exactly what to expect, only that Pastor Wilson had promised something different. Vernon arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, entering through the back door to avoid the crowd. His hands trembled as he sat on the small wooden stage, looking at the old upright piano that had been wheeled out for the occasion. It wasn't a good piano. The keys were yellowed, some of them sticking slightly. It was desperately out of tune. But it would have to do. Rebecca found him backstage, his face pale, his breathing shallow. "Vernon, are you okay?" "I can't do this," he whispered. "Rebecca, I can't. Look at all those people. What was I thinking?" Rebecca knelt down beside him, taking his shaking hands in hers. "You were thinking that your gift might help. And it will. I believe that. What if I freeze? What if my hands don't work? What if... Then you do your best anyway. Vernon, perfection isn't the goal here. Connection is." Darius appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Crawford, it's time." Vernon stood on legs that felt like water. He walked toward the stage, every step feeling like moving through concrete. As he pushed through the curtain and stepped into view of the crowd, the murmur of conversation died down. People looked at him with confusion, some with recognition, many with, "Who is that?" written across their faces. Pastor Wilson stood and walked to the microphone. His voice, usually strong, wavered slightly. "Thank you all for coming. I know many of you are skeptical. I know we've tried everything we can think of to bring healing to our community, and nothing has worked. Tonight I'm asking you to try something different, to open your hearts to possibility." He gestured toward Vernon. "This is Vernon Crawford. Many of you know him as the janitor at Riverside High School. What you don't know is that Vernon is also a gifted musician. 43 years ago, he lost his wife in a tragic accident and walked away from a promising career. He's kept his music private all these years, but tonight he's willing to share it with us. He's composed a piece specifically about Riverside, about our pain and our potential. All I ask is that you listen, really listen." The skepticism in the room was palpable. Vernon could feel it pressing against him like a physical force. He saw Tommy Sullivan shake his head, saw several people exchange doubtful glances, saw the sea of faces that expected nothing and were prepared to be proved right. Vernon walked to the piano and sat down. His work shirt felt suddenly too tight, too cheap, too inappropriate for what he was about to attempt. His hands hovered over the keys, frozen. This was a mistake. He should leave, should apologize and walk away and go back to being invisible. But then he saw Darius's face in the crowd, saw the hope there, the desperate belief that something good could still happen. He saw Rebecca mouthing the words, "You can do this." He saw Emma Parker, the little girl from the grocery store, sitting with her parents, her small face full of trust. Vernon closed his eyes. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the 43 years he had spent hiding. He thought of all the pain he had witnessed in Riverside, all the fractures he had seen deepen. And then, before fear could stop him, Vernon began to play. The first note that came from the old piano was rough, slightly off-key from the instrument's poor tuning. But it didn't matter. That first note carried something that transcended technical perfection. It carried truth. Vernon's damaged hands moved across the keys, finding the melody he had refined over weeks of late-night sessions. Riverside's lament began softly, almost hesitantly, like a question being asked in a dark room. The melody was simple at first, just a few notes repeated, but there was something in the way Vernon played them, a weight, a sorrow that made people lean forward despite themselves. Tommy Sullivan, who had been prepared to walk out at the first sign of pretentious nonsense, found himself frozen in his seat. That opening melody, it sounded like loneliness. It sounded like sitting in an empty apartment drinking beer and wondering what happened to your life. The melody built slowly, adding layers. Vernon's left hand, the damaged one, played a bass line that rumbled like distant thunder, steady and inevitable. His right hand wove in and out, creating harmonies that were sometimes beautiful, sometimes discordant, always honest. Maria Rodriguez felt tears prick her eyes without knowing why. The music was speaking a language her conscious mind didn't understand, but her heart did. It sounded like watching your father's dream die. It sounded like fighting to keep something alive when the world insists on letting it go. The composition moved through movements, each one telling part of Riverside's story. There was a section that sounded angry, harsh notes crashing against each other like arguments at a town meeting. Vernon played it with his jaw clenched, channeling every heated word he had heard, every relationship fractured by stress and fear, and the desperate need to blame someone, anyone, for the pain. Lisa Barnes gripped her husband's hand. She heard in that angry section all the righteous fury she had felt, the exhaustion of fighting to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. The music didn't judge that anger. It acknowledged it, gave it space, let it exist without shame. Then the music shifted again, becoming quieter, sadder. This was the sound of grief. Not the loud, dramatic grief of fresh loss, but the deep, quiet grief of years passing, of dreams postponed and then forgotten, of watching your community slowly fade and not knowing how to stop it. Pastor Wilson, sitting in the front row, felt his throat tighten. This was the grief he carried every day, the weight of watching his flock suffer and not being able to shepherd them to safety. The music understood. It didn't offer easy solutions or false hope. It just sat with the grief, let it breathe, honored it. Vernon played on his eyes closed now, his body swaying slightly with the movement of the music. His hands were hurting, the old injury making itself known, but he didn't stop. He was past the point where stopping was possible. The music had taken over, was playing through him rather than from him. The composition built toward its climax, the melody growing more complex, more urgent. This was the sound of a community at a crossroads, standing on the edge of either complete dissolution or unexpected healing. The notes climbed higher, faster, Vernon's damaged hands pushing themselves to their limit. Darius, watching from the back, felt his breath catch. He had heard Vernon play before, but this was different. This wasn't practice. This was Vernon pouring 43 years of silence into sound, letting everything he had held back come flooding out in a torrent of melody and harmony and raw, unfiltered emotion. And then, just when it seemed the music couldn't build any higher, Vernon brought it down. The angry, urgent notes resolved into something softer. Not happy, exactly, but peaceful, accepting. The melody simplified, returning to something close to the opening theme, but transformed now, carrying the weight of everything that had come before, but also suggesting the possibility of something beyond grief. This final section sounded like forgiveness. Not the easy forgiveness of forgetting, but the hard forgiveness of acknowledging hurt and choosing connection anyway. It sounded like neighbors who had stopped speaking beginning to nod hello. It sounded like communities discovering they had more in common than they thought. It sounded like hands reaching across divides, hesitant, but hopeful. Tommy Sullivan, that bitter, angry man who had come prepared to scoff, felt tears running down his face. He didn't even realize he was crying until the woman next to him handed him a tissue. The music was reaching into a place in his chest he thought had turned to stone. Finding grief he didn't know how to express, acknowledging it, and gently suggesting he didn't have to carry it alone. Maria Rodriguez openly sobbed her father's arm around her shoulders. The music was telling her story, validating her struggle, honoring her father's dream, even as it acknowledged the reality that dreams sometimes have to change. It was giving her permission to grieve and hope simultaneously. All around the room, people were experiencing their own private reactions to Vernon's music. Some cried, some sat in stunned silence. Some reached for the hands of those next to them, suddenly needing human connection. The music was doing what 5 years of meetings and arguments and well-meaning attempts at unity had failed to do. It was creating a shared emotional experience that transcended words. Vernon played the last measures of Riverside's Lament, with his entire body, every ounce of his being focused on these final notes. The melody returned one last time to the opening theme, but it was transformed now, carrying everything the journey through the composition had revealed. It ended softly, a single note held for a long moment, before fading into silence. The silence that followed was profound. Vernon kept his hands on the keys, his eyes still closed, his breathing ragged. He was shaking, exhausted, feeling like he had just run a marathon or fought a war. He had given everything he had, and he had no idea if it had been enough. For 10 seconds, 15, 20, the silence held. Vernon began to feel panic rise in his chest. They hated it. It was too personal, too raw, too much. He had made a fool of himself. And then someone started clapping. Vernon opened his eyes and turned to see who it was. Tommy Sullivan. The angry, bitter man who had been so hostile at the last meeting was on his feet, clapping with tears streaming down his weathered face. Then, Maria Rodriguez stood joining in. Then Lisa Barnes. Then Darius. Then Rebecca. Like a wave, the entire room rose to its feet, applause building from a few people to a crescendo that filled the community center. But it wasn't the polite applause of a formal concert. It was something rawer, more desperate. People were clapping through tears, some of them openly sobbing while they applauded. The applause went on, and Vernon sat frozen at the piano, overwhelmed by the response. Pastor Wilson was crying, making no attempt to hide it. He had asked God for a miracle, and maybe impossibly this was it. The applause finally began to die down, but people didn't sit. They stood there looking at Vernon with something that transcended appreciation for a performance. They were looking at him like he had just articulated something they had been feeling but couldn't express, like he had given voice to their collective pain, and in doing so had made it slightly more bearable. Tommy Sullivan, still crying, walked toward the stage. He climbed the steps, and for a moment Vernon thought the man was angry, was going to confront him about something. But instead, Tommy reached out and pulled Vernon into a tight embrace. "Thank you," Tommy whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for understanding." Then others were moving toward the stage. Maria came up and hugged Vernon, speaking rapid Spanish through her tears. Darius was grinning through his own tears, saying, I told you," over and over. Rebecca simply squeezed his hand, no words necessary. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years were suddenly talking, crying together, embracing. The barriers that had seemed so insurmountable 30 minutes ago were crumbling in the aftermath of Vernon's music. It wasn't that all the problems were solved. The mill was still closed. People still needed jobs. The economic and racial tensions were still real. But for the first time in 5 years, people were seeing each other as human beings rather than adversaries. Vernon stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed and exhausted, his damaged hands aching fiercely. He felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had in years, and he understood that this was what she had meant. This is what his gift was for. Not for concert halls or critical acclaim, but for moments like this. For healing, for connection, for reminding people of their shared humanity. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, people kept coming up to Vernon, thanking him, telling him their stories, asking when he would play again. He was exhausted, his social battery completely depleted, but he made himself stand there and receive their gratitude, understanding that they needed this as much as he did. Finally, as the community center emptied out, Vernon found himself alone on the stage. He looked down at the old, out-of-tune piano, this imperfect instrument that had somehow been enough. He sat back down on the bench and played a single note, letting it ring out in the empty room. It was still out of tune, still imperfect, but it was beautiful anyway. The change in Riverside didn't happen overnight. Despite what movies might suggest, one beautiful moment doesn't erase 5 years of division and pain, but it created an opening, a possibility that hadn't existed before. The next community meeting 1 week later had twice as many attendees. The atmosphere was different, People still disagreed, still argued, still had legitimate grievances that needed addressing. But they spoke to each other differently now. They listened more. They sought understanding rather than just trying to win. Tommy Sullivan apologized publicly for some of the harsh things he had said. It was awkward, halting, but genuine. Several people approached him afterward, sharing their own regrets. They formed a job seekers support group, helping each other navigate the brutal market-sharing leads, offering encouragement. Maria Rodriguez's grocery store saw an uptick in business. Not enough to save it entirely, but enough to give her hope. Several community members organized a Shop Local campaign, recognizing that every dollar spent at Maria's stayed in Riverside, circulated through their community, meant something more than just a transaction. The town council approved a community garden project on some unused land near the old mill. Black families, white families, Hispanic families worked side by side, turning dirt planting seeds, building something together. It was small, it was symbolic. But symbols matter when you're trying to heal. Vernon, for his part, was asked to give piano lessons to interested children at the community center every Saturday. He was terrified at first, worried he wouldn't be a good teacher, that his damaged technique would confuse students. But Rebecca convinced him to try. The first Saturday, 8 children showed up. By the third week, he had 15 students. The children didn't care that his left hand couldn't move as smoothly as it should. They were fascinated by his stories, inspired by his music, and gradually becoming better players themselves. Vernon found that teaching gave him something he hadn't had in decades, a sense of purpose beyond just surviving. He was investing in these children and Riverside's future. Sarah would have loved seeing him do this. He could feel her approval, like sunshine. Darius became Vernon's unofficial assistant, helping set up equipment, organizing sheet music, and learning piano himself. The young man had found a mentor, and Vernon had found something like a grandson. They would talk for hours after lessons, Darius asking about Berkeley, about Boston, about what it was like to lose everything and somehow keep going. "Do you think you'll ever go back?" Darius asked one evening. "To playing professionally, I mean." Vernon smiled. "No, that wasn't my path. This is teaching, playing for people who need it. That's enough." "But you're so talented. You could—" "Talent isn't the point, Darius. Connection is. I spent 43 years playing for myself, hiding my gift because I was afraid of being hurt again. These past few months playing for others, teaching these kids, I've felt more alive than I have since Sarah died." Pastor Wilson incorporated music more deliberately into his church services, asking Vernon to play occasionally. Vernon agreed, though he was careful to keep it modest. He didn't want to become a performer again. He wanted to be a person who used his gift to serve, not to elevate himself. The change in the community wasn't total. Some people still left Riverside, pursuing opportunities elsewhere. The economic challenges remained real. The racial tensions didn't magically disappear, but there was a shift in the underlying tone of the town. People were trying. They were reaching across divides with tentative hands, acknowledging hurt, seeking repair. 6 months after Vernon's performance, the town held its first annual Riverside Unity Festival. It featured local musicians, including several of Vernon's students. There was food from different cultural traditions, games for children, a community art project where people painted their hopes for the town's future. Vernon attended, standing at the edge of the festival, watching his neighbors laugh and talk and slowly rebuild connections. He wasn't at the center of it anymore. He didn't need to be. The healing was happening with or without him now, and that was exactly as it should be. Rebecca found him there, handed him a lemonade, and stood beside him in comfortable silence for a moment. "You did this," she finally said. "No," Vernon replied. "We all did this. I just played some music. You gave people permission to feel, to be vulnerable. That's not nothing." Vernon smiled. "Maybe, but the real work, the hard work of actually changing, of listening to each other, of building something new, that's all them. I'm just happy I could help a little." As the sun set over Riverside, casting long shadows across the festival grounds, Vernon felt something he hadn't felt in 4 decades. He felt like he was home. Not just physically present in a place, but truly home, connected to a community, part of something larger than himself. Sarah would have been proud. More importantly, Vernon was proud of himself. He had taken his broken hands, his broken heart, his broken life, and had somehow created something beautiful from the pieces. That was enough. More than enough. 2 years after that first performance, Vernon Crawford was 74 years old and still teaching piano every Saturday. His students had grown in number and skill. 3 of them had been accepted into college music programs. Several more were discovering that music could be a refuge, a way to process feelings they didn't have words for. Riverside's Lament was performed every year at the anniversary of the Unity Festival, sometimes by Vernon, sometimes by his students, once by a visiting orchestra that had heard the story and wanted to honor it. The composition had become part of Riverside's identity, a reminder of where they had been and where they were trying to go. The town was still struggling economically. That reality hadn't changed. But people had changed. They approached their challenges differently now, with more empathy, more willingness to work together, more recognition that they were all in this together. Vernon still lived in his small house on Birch Street. He still did his own grocery shopping, still attended church every Sunday. But he was no longer invisible. People greeted him by name, stopped to chat, asked about his students, thanked him for what he had given them. Sometimes late at night, Vernon would sit at his piano and play just for himself. He would think about Sarah, about Berkeley, about the life that could have been. There was still grief there that never fully went away, but it no longer defined him. He had learned something important: brokenness doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes brokenness is just the middle, the part where everything seems lost before you discover what comes next. His hands were broken, but they could still play. His heart was broken, but it could still love. His dreams were broken, but new dreams could grow from the pieces. Vernon had spent 43 years trying to protect himself from more loss by refusing to be fully present in life. He had thought that by making himself small, invisible, he could avoid being hurt again. But he had it backward. The pain of losing Sarah wasn't lessened by hiding. It was only in opening himself up again, in risking connection, in sharing his gift with others, that the pain became bearable. One Saturday evening after his students had left, Vernon sat alone in the community center. He placed his hands on the piano, feeling the familiar texture of the keys, the weight of the instrument under his fingers. He began to play not Riverside's Lament this time, but something new. Something that sounded like gratitude, like second chances, like hope that had been earned through suffering. The music filled the empty room, spilling out the windows into the riverside evening. A few people passing by stopped to listen. They didn't know what he was playing, didn't need to. They just stood there letting the music wash over them, feeling something they couldn't quite name, but desperately needed. This was Vernon Crawford's legacy. Not fame or fortune or recognition beyond a small Tennessee town. His legacy was connection. It was healing. It was the reminder that beauty can exist in broken places, that gifts are meant to be shared, that it's never too late to stop hiding and start living. As the last notes faded into the twilight, Vernon smiled. He thought about everything he had lost and everything he had found. He thought about Sarah, about Riverside, about the unexpected journey that had brought him here. And he was grateful for all of it. Even the pain. Because the pain had taught him compassion. The loss had taught him what truly mattered. The brokenness had taught him that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from imperfect hands, playing imperfect instruments in imperfect circumstances. Vernon stood up from the piano, turned off the lights, and walked out into the Riverside evening. He had been invisible for 43 years. He had been silent for 4 decades. But he was invisible no more. He was silent no longer. And somehow, impossibly, that made all the difference.